recording now.
I can't say that I remember Martin Kassendorf, our speaker today, back in the days when we were both at UCLA. We were in the very same class, and we had the very same major. But this guy was really busy. This guy was busy putting out the Daily Bruin, the newspaper of UCLA, for 4 years as its major reporter, and then he became the editor-in-chief for 2 years for that newspaper. After UCLA, he goes to Harvard, he gets his law degree, and you would expect that he would go into the field of law, which he may have done for a little while, but then he met his true calling, and he became a journalist. So he had a career in journalism that we're going to be hearing about today. And I'm not going to go into that at all. So, but I do want you to know that he was honored to be the 2021 Distinguished Alumnus of UCLA. He got that award. But that wasn't the only one. Throughout his career, he garnered many more honors and accolades for his lifelong work in journalism. Interestingly, he also excelled athletically. He ran, how many? 26 marathons. Can you imagine? 26 marathons? Yes, Suzanne, I know you're right. And then he ran the Boston Marathon 4 times. And he still runs every day. Did you do it today?
No.
No. You will later.
No.
Are those your original knees?
Well, Martin and his wife Irma, who's sitting behind, she's going to be videographed. I just was talking to Irma, and she told me that their very first date was going to the White House for Christmas. This is the first date he took her. So they're newcomers to Santa Barbara. And they actually had retired to a nice, comfortable home on the canals of Venice. Not Venice, Italy. Venice and Santa Monica. But 2 years ago, only 2 years ago, they went through a catastrophe that would strike terror in any one of your hearts. Their house was in flames, smoke everywhere, in the middle of the night. They flee immediately without even putting any shoes on, without grabbing a wallet or their purse or their money or anything. They just grabbed the dog.
And the cat.
Well, the cat didn't. The
cat
cat ran away on its own, okay? Well, when everything cleared off, they went to their home and they found that all they had left were ashes. Ashes of their cars were gone, all of their artworks were gone, all of their books were burned, and the memorabilia of his professional life. Imagine. So I'm glad to say that Irma and Martin have settled here in Santa Barbara, and they actually live very close to this very spot where we are. And Martin had noticed a stream of cars coming through the driveway in the parking lot on a Monday, and he expected, sure, on a Sunday, but what is going on here? And he's a reporter. He has this natural curiosity, and so somehow he found out that it was because of Vista's lifelong learning classes, and you know the rest from that. So, all I got to say is that the people of Venice have lost a very distinguished citizen, but we have gained here the benefit of a valuable addition not only to Vista's but to our whole community.
Oh, yeah. Cool. Well, welcome, Vista's members, newcomers, visitors. I'm just asking you to hold any questions till till the end because I've got 319 slides to get through. It was Democratic campaign strategist James Carville who coined the phrase, "Washington is Hollywood for ugly people." It's a rare happenstance that I reported from both of those high-profile news fronts, plus a lot more in the course of rubbing shoulders with about 700 celebrities over a 45-year career in journalism. I apologize in advance for what may sound like bragging, but I was indeed lucky enough to punch all the tickets from the LA overnight police beat to the White House and overseas. Politics, entertainment, foreign affairs, criminal trials, the Olympics, the World Series, the bombs and guns of Northern Ireland's communal troubles. Today I'm taking you to the campaign planes, the motorcades, and the sometimes glorious, sometimes inglorious tumult of America's evolving politics. Movie stars? That's next week. Of the 15 presidents in my lifetime, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the only one I did not meet or at least see in person. I conversed with 9 presidents. I saw the 5 others from a distance. I traveled with losing presidential nominees too. The commanders-in-chief I spoke with ranged from Truman to Trump. In his case, our talk was in 1987, long before his political life. In New York, for the Long Island newspaper Newsday, I phoned him on some subject relating to business or entertainment I don't even remember now. Trump, easy for the news media to reach, courted any publicity he could get. I especially enjoyed national party conventions. I took that picture in Boston with Kerry in 2004 when he was nominated. 13 of these political and news media reunions from 1960 to 2004. They were in Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, Houston, Detroit, and Kansas City. It wasn't just politicians I met, it was also the consequential newsmakers who influenced them, like Cesar Chavez, now a street name here in Santa Barbara near the ocean. But then, the farm workers leader I interviewed at his union headquarters. Martin Luther King Jr. I walked with him at a civil rights march in LA, unpictured here, different march. Retired from the political wars since 2007, I moved to Santa Barbara with my wife Irma just a year ago after a fire set next door by homeless squatters destroyed our home in the Venice Beach canals of Los Angeles. I lost quite a few photos I had taken over the years, but luckily my computer was in the shop for an upgrade. So some digital copies were saved, and you will see some of these mementos in my 2 presentations. I was not a total stranger to this beautiful city. My Santa Barbara connections, in fact, go back to 1960. For the now defunct Hearst Los Angeles Examiner, I covered old Spanish days, now called Fiesta. I remember Governor Pat Brown there, astride a Palomino in the parade, looking paunchy and terrified to be on a horse. In 1973, there I was in Santa Barbara in a hot tub with 14 uninhibited citizens, sharing the town's new fad with notepad in hand, while a teenage cutie fed me grapes. Irma and I have a hot tub here. In 1996, I was here with President Bill Clinton on a re-election campaign stop at Santa Barbara City College, where I now run on the stadium track. During his speech on campaign fundraising issues, Clinton endorsed a religion professor named Walter Capps in his campaign to defeat the veteran Republican Congressman Bob Lagomarsino. Clinton helped Capps win, but The liberal new lawmaker died 14 months into his term. He died of a heart attack in the arms of his wife Lois, a nurse. She won the special election to replace him and served in Congress for 19 years. Santa Barbara, Santa Maria, this area. I covered her first campaign for USA Today. I traveled for months with their very tall daughter, Laura Capps, when she was a staff assistant to John Kerry in his 2004 presidential campaign. She is now, as you may know, a Santa Barbara County supervisor. What a dynasty. For me, the politics started long ago in Brooklyn, where as a kid I went to Ebbets Field to cheer the Brooklyn Dodgers, the iconic Boys of Summer, Jackie Robinson, Duke Snyder, Gil Hodges, Roy Campanella, Pee Wee Reese, Carl Furillo. My first memory of politics was watching Harry S. Truman's 1948 re-election win on our, that is, election win, because he succeeded Roosevelt, and this was his first time running, on our 7-inch TV. I was only 8, but I was fascinated. I asked my mother, "Mommy, are we Republicans or Democrats?" "Democrats," she said. But as a professional journalist, I had trusting sources in both parties. And my news organizations and I shunned the partisanship we see today on Fox News and MSNBC. New York City Mayor William O'Dwyer was my first political celebrity. He came to our temple on a Sunday morning in 1951 for the opening of a new Hebrew school building. He joked, "You're making me late for Mass up at St. Pat's." The next year, I snapped Eleanor Roosevelt with a Kodak Brownie at her Hyde Park home. I next saw that great woman 8 years later, speaking at the 1960 LA Democratic Convention for Adlai Stevenson against Senator John F. Kennedy, who beat Stevenson for the nomination. With my twin brother Lawrence, I enrolled at UCLA, where I joined the campus newspaper, the Daily Bruin, advancing up the ranks until I was elected editor-in-chief in my first and only political campaign. In a hangover from the McCarthy era, the deans worried that a commie radical leftist might become editor, so the whole student body had to vote, which is really ridiculous, actually. They don't do that anymore. Since mostly fraternity and sorority members living near campus bothered to vote, their general conservatism ensured that no red would ever win. I strategically joined Phi Sigma Delta as a sophomore and got my fraternity's door-knocking help to defeat Russ Wiley of Sigma Nu. 36 years later, I was with President Clinton in Texas at a federal science facility called the Superconducting Super Collider, and Russ Wiley was there to greet me. He was the public information officer there, very friendly to the press corps, traveling with the man who was considering the facility's giant budget. Somehow or other, I got to introduce President Truman to a capacity crowd of 2,000 at Royce Hall at UCLA when he came for a speech in 1960. "Thank you, Marty," this historical figure graciously told the audience. Truman was a people person, a political natural who remembered everybody's name. The only match I ever saw for him was Bill Clinton. That spring, Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts, running for president, came to UCLA for a speech during the California Democratic primary. He made a point of looking up the Daily Bruin editor. I asked him if he had read the book on freedom of information by the political columnists Joseph and Stuart Alsop, who were actually old family friends of the Kennedy. He said, yes. I met Kennedy several times in later months. I have always regretted that I never had my picture taken with him, as Clinton was smart enough to do. But then, unlike Clinton, I was not running for president one day. After graduation from UCLA, I became a cub reporter for the Examiner, the morning competitor of the LA Times, since 1903. I had been the UCLA campus stringer for the paper and a city room reporter there in the summer of 1959 before senior year. Within weeks, at age 20, I was covering the Democratic Convention at the LA Sports Arena, squeezed between delegates wildly enthusiastic about Kennedy. I wrote my share of feature stories during the convention, but I was so junior on the staff that one night I had to vacate my press seat for Luella Parsons, Hearst's Hollywood gossip columnist. That fall, I wrote about the Kennedy-Nixon race doing no travel, but having some striking experiences. When Kennedy rode in a downtown LA motorcade just before Election Day, I became one of the boys on the bus. There were so few women political reporters back then. My seatmate on the bus was a roly-poly, elfin little guy. Eager to meet star senior journalist, I asked him, "Who are you with?" Modestly, he said, "Oh, I'm not with anybody. I'm just writing a book." He was Theodore H. White, Teddy White, the unparalleled insider, whose book, The Making of the President in 1960, sold 4 million copies in an immortal reporting feat he repeated in 1964, 1968, and 1972. As the Kennedy caravan inched through enormous street crowds, I heard a loud bang. Fearing it was a gunshot, I jumped off the bus to check it out, surprised that I was the only reporter who did. It still seems surreal that when I sprinted up to Kennedy, he was standing alone in the middle of the street. The world fell away. We were just the two of us in an eerie silence. I gasped, "Are you all right?" "Yes," he assured me in that Boston accent. On November 22nd, 1963, I remembered that chilling vehicle backfire on South Broadway in Los Angeles. I had met Vice President Richard Nixon in Indianapolis at a college journalism conference the previous year. Awkwardly, he tried his best to connect. UCLA, the Bruins, Coach Red Sanders. Actually, the football coach had died a year earlier. Nixon settled at the Ambassador Hotel on election night to await returns. I still have my press badge. I could probably get some money for that on eBay, I don't know. The vote was too close to call. Nixon came down for a short non-committal speech at midnight, then ran up a dark back staircase to his floor. I pounded up the stairs right behind him and was the last person to wish him good night as he closed the door to his suite. Next morning, he was declared a loser. Politics was hard fought, but more civilized then, with little rancor between politicians and journalists. Nixon was a partisan Republican, all right, but he was not far to the right by today's standards. Newspapers, news magazines, and the 3 TV networks were the dominant media, practically the only media. How different, polarized, and atomized things are now. Kennedy was president. After 6 months in the U.S. Army before 6 years of National Guard service, I returned to the Examiner. The paper died a month later, in January 1962, and I moved back to New York in a brief, unsatisfying look at corporate life at an IBM company magazine. Hated that. I took this picture of Kennedy dedicating a labor union's housing project in Manhattan. There was practically no security. I could just kind of walk right up and shoot. After a semester of graduate study in journalism at UCLA, I was hired at the Hearst San Francisco Examiner, where I covered the civil rights movement. I was 23, though, and restless, inspired by Kennedy's Harvard cachet and a book of reminiscence by Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, a Harvard Law School alum. I was accepted at the law school. I started there in September 1963. Dallas, November 22nd. I could not bear helplessly watching that weekend's grievous events on TV. I had to live it, had to be in the action. I called the Examiner and offered to pay my own way down to Washington, sending them stories on the historic happenings. They agreed. In bitter winds, I stood at the curb watching the Kennedy family and world leaders in mournful procession to St. Matthew's Cathedral, where I witnessed the funeral service before the president I so admired was laid to rest at Arlington. At Harvard Law, Archibald Cox, later the Watergate special prosecutor fired by Nixon, was just back from serving as U.S. Solicitor General before the Supreme Court. Archie Cox was the mentor who put me over the top for cum laude honors with A grades in constitutional law and my third-year thesis. He offered to recommend me to the Department of Justice, which he had just left. Guy had contacts. I might have gone there to a whole different life, but Lyndon Johnson was president, and his Justice Department was putting my Vietnam War dodging friends in prison. My close friend and study group partner at Harvard Law was Larry Tribe. Professor Lawrence Tribe, who became a leading constitutional scholar at the law school. In 2000, Larry argued for Al Gore before the Supreme Court. His side lost. Also in our class was a silent wallflower from New Hampshire I never spoke with. His name was David Souter, and he was the last classmate I would have ever expected to make it to the Supreme Court. June 1964. That summer vacation, riding 6,000 miles around Europe on a Vespa motor scooter, I was in Berlin on the first anniversary of JFK's Ich bin ein Berliner speech. Robert F. Kennedy came to the same city hall to unveil a commemorative plaque. As I snapped photos, I was stunned to see the adoring Berliners giving RFK the Heil salute, a instinct left over from the old days, I guess. Upon graduation in 1966, I went back to journalism, hired at prosperous Newsweek by Chief of Correspondence Jim Cannon, later a top advisor to Nelson Rockefeller when he was governor of New York and vice president of the United States. I was outbound for California to take the bar exam at the end of summer, so Newsweek started me in the 5-correspondent Los Angeles bureau. Our territory, Southern California, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Hawaii. The big boss was Katharine Graham, chairwoman of the Washington Post Company, owner of Newsweek as well. I met her every so often, once chauffeuring her to the Bel Air Hotel in my Mercury Capri clunker to meet her friend Warren Buffett. Though born rich, Kay Graham was down to earth in her way. She phoned the LA Bureau one day, and unfortunately a temp secretary on the advertising side answered. In her aristocratic tones, the company owner said, "Hello, this is Kay Graham. I'm going back to Washington early, and I need to change my flight reservation." The clueless temp said, "Madam, this is Newsweek magazine, not a travel agency." And hung up. Kay called back and got the same dismissal. She called a third time and said, look, let me talk to Sharon. The temp transferred her to Sharon Hayden, an advertising worker Kay knew, and she said, "Sharon, this is Kay. Who is that fucking woman?" I was soon plunged into the politics of 1966. Pat Brown, re-elected in 1962 as governor when he beat Nixon, was trying for the third term. That's always a long shot, made tougher for Brown by public sentiment against Berkeley anti-war protesters. This was capitalized on by Reagan. I was in the Victory Night crowd with Ronald Reagan at the Century Plaza Hotel, as I was 14 years later when he won the presidency. As a University of California graduate, I was not fond of Reagan as the governor of California, who fired the respected UC president, Clark Kerr, just like he fired all the air traffic controllers as president. June 1967, the Vietnam War home front. In respectable national media suit and tie, standing out like that, outside the Century Plaza where President Johnson was meeting with Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin, I was covering a peaceful, giant protest. The LAPD, though, declared it an unlawful assembly and, anticipating Chicago a year later, moved in with billy clubs. A cop, not very bravely, clubbed me upside the head from behind. I tumbled to the ground. Man, did that hurt. That was the quintessential 1960s experience. So was the 1968 Democratic primary campaign of Robert F. Kennedy. The brooding but charismatic senator from New York entered the presidential contest after Johnson dropped out. In my first campaign travel, I was on the plane and bus with RFK through Oregon and California. in the last week of his life. Crowds were ecstatic everywhere. One Kennedy staffer was Dick Tuck of Los Angeles, the impish Democratic prankster who had bedeviled Nixon for years. Bobby and Ethel were riding in an open convertible on the 101 near Ventura when Freckles, their Springer Spaniel, kept trying to jump out. Kennedy halted the motorcade, summoned Dick Tuck from the bus, and handed him Freckles for safety. When Tuck reboarded the bus with the dog in his arms, we razzed him, "Look at you, Dick, a grown man with such a lowly political role." Tuck replied, "Listen, Freckles may be a spaniel to you, but he's an ambassadorship to me." Kennedy lost to Gene McCarthy in Oregon, but won California on June 4th. I was in the happy crowd in the Ambassador Hotel's embassy ballroom when the senator said, "So it's on to Chicago, and let's win there." I did not follow Kennedy into the kitchen pantry that he was passing through to hold a news conference in the next room where my boss, the Newsweek bureau chief, was handling things. Like his brother Jack, Kennedy was shot. Word spread through the ballroom, and it took me a few minutes to struggle through the panicked crowd to reach the pantry. Police already had arrested Sirhan Sirhan, a 24-year-old Palestinian immigrant. The mortally wounded senator had just been removed by ambulance. 5 injured gunshot victims were still writhing on the pantry floor. I kneeled in blood to interview them. They included the Western director of the United Auto Workers and a radio reporter. Assigned that night to the police investigation and the courtroom aspects of the continuing story, I contributed to the ensuing Newsweek cover roundups and spent much of the next year on the case. In fact, I met my first wife at a high-security pretrial court hearing for Sirhan. 25 years later, I went back to the failing Ambassador Hotel for an anniversary story. I asked a gaggle of teenage girls if they knew that Bobby Kennedy had been shot there. They asked me, "Who is Bobby Kennedy?" And that was one of the saddest moments of my life. In 1972, Newsweek promoted me to London bureau chief, directing news coverage in the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Scandinavia. At 32, I was affecting a Pancho Villa mustache to look older. Prime Minister Edward Heath, hosting American Correspondents one day at number 10 Downing Street, shook my hand and inquired, "Were you posted here from Washington or New York?" Innocently, I answered, "Los Angeles." Well, Heath scowled, turned on his heel, and stomped away. To the Prime Minister of Great Britain, it was as if I had said Disneyland, a measure of how far the British Empire had fallen. In the year or so I was in the UK, I spent nearly half my time in Northern Ireland, recording the bloody troubles between Protestants and Catholics. By the time I left, my highest activist sources on both sides had been assassinated. In Belfast, I stayed at the Hotel Europa. Late one weeknight, the Provisional IRA politely warned by phone that they had planted a bomb in the hotel. I was rushed into the street in pajamas. With a mighty explosion, one wing of the hotel blew up. Since my room was in another wing, I went back to sleep. I filed one story on Britain reluctantly entering the European Union. In 2014, as you know, it Brexited. Norway was similarly standoffish, rejecting common market membership in a referendum I covered from Oslo. Christmas, 1972, Nixon bombed Hanoi, a dramatic escalation in the war. Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme compared the US to the worst of the Nazis. Our relations plummeted. I flew to Stockholm on a tight deadline and got Palme's views into that week's magazine. In 1986, Palme was assassinated, walking with his wife on a Stockholm street. The crime has never been solved. My return to Newsweek in Los Angeles coincided with the breakout of Watergate. I worked on Western aspects of the scandal, checking out a rumored Republican bagman and getting a death threat for it on my phone, and visiting federal prisons where convicted Nixon officials were dispatched. I ran into the young conspirator Donald Segretti in the prison carpentry shop finishing a door. Nixon had hired him as a troll to punk the Democrats, insisting that he needed what he called a Dick Tuck capability. The difference was that Tuck was funny, Nixon was lawless. In San Diego, I made a discovery. A progressive, reforming new Republican mayor, Pete Wilson. Newsweek ran the first national story on Wilson, and he gratefully answered my phone calls for the rest of his political career. In 1974, the year Nixon helicoptered into exile, I followed Sherry Brown's Small is Beautiful rise to governor of California. I had known Pat Brown's son since 1969, when he ran for the board of the Los Angeles Junior College District, of all things. Our mutual friend Joe Sorrell, Jerry's campaign strategist, asked him, come on, junior college. Your name is Edmund G. Brown Jr. What do you really want? Jerry Brown was to occupy much of my reporting life for decades. Newsweek lapped up everything he did, especially dating Linda Ronstadt. Through the Democratic presidential primaries of 1976 and 1992, I traveled thousands of miles with Brown's low-budget campaigns as he coped with his Governor Moonbeam reputation. We did not have press buses, we had Dodge minivans driven by teenage volunteers. Our 1976 ride in Oregon was a wheezing, pitching DC-3 we called the Vomit Comet. In Utica, New York in 1992, Brown's chaotic cavalcade drove off to the airport, stranding me and George Skelton of the LA Times in the schoolroom where we were finishing our story. We ran into the street and hailed a police officer. He obligingly drove us right onto the runway to catch the departing plane. Life with Jerry. But Jerry connected with a lot of people. As he won primaries in places like Colorado and Vermont, somebody on the plane quipped, yeah, Jerry always wins there, there are mountains. In 1976, Brown, for all his faults, was the last Democrat standing against Jimmy Carter, amassing the second largest haul of convention delegates. He did it again with Bill Clinton in 1992, so actually he did pretty well. Brown's finances got a bit better the older he got. In 1992, we even had a Gulfstream jet from Minneapolis to Burlington, Vermont. And from there to New York, I was the only passenger with Brown and his oddball French advisor, Jacques Barzaghi, in a Learjet. So things were looking up. A nationally significant property tax revolt broke out in California in 1978. Proposition 13. Newsweek scrambled to put the initiative battle on the cover as I followed Howard Jarvis, the homely folk hero who thought up the idea around the state. The issue of limiting property taxes, which in fact were skyrocketing in the free spending twilight of liberal ascendancy, split the electorate along unpredictable lines. Take, for example, the intimate Santa Monica dinner party to which the theater director Gordon Davidson and his wife Judy Davidson invited me and my then wife Jeannie, a writer for Rupert Murdoch's New West magazine. Henry Fonda and his fifth wife Shirley were two of the guests. Lew Wasserman of Universal Pictures, the most powerful executive in Hollywood, and his wife Edie Wasserman also were there. All 8 of us were Democrats. Discussion turned to Prop 13, which Jeannie had just favored in an article. I backed her, having witnessed an elderly woman nearly faint with anxiety opening her tax bill. Henry Fonda, remember this is Tom Joad from The Grapes of Wrath. Henry Fonda, the wealthy Henry Fonda, sneered, "You mean to say you can't pay your property taxes?" I said we still could, but we were beginning to worry. Jeannie and Fonda went at it. The Wassermans, Democratic mega-donors, took the movie star's side. To me, the cliches about out-of-touch Hollywood limousine liberals were proving true. And as Newsweek suspected, Prop 13's passage foreshadowed the national conservative victory of Ronald Reagan 2 years later. In 1979, I did some more foreign reporting, going to Mexico for a comprehensive look at that country and President Jose López Portillo. I stood beside him on Cinco de Mayo, as in his sash of office, he he greeted 1 million people on the Zocalo, Mexico City's colonial-era main square. Then it was on to the Bahamas to watch the deposed Shah of Iran swimming and playing tennis while quietly dying of cancer. Speaking of Reagan, who had lost to President Ford in the 1976 GOP primary, he was often running again. Equipped in 1980 with a Secret Service pass, I was with him on the long journey to the White House. Reagan solicited Newsweek's goodwill with a 1979 dinner for me and 2 New York editors at his all-electric Pacific Palisades home, with appliances General Electric installed for free when Reagan hosted GE Theater on TV. A deferential Latino butler served prime steak and a nicely matched French red with an impudent little finish and a subtle hint of oak and cherry. Reagan wore a garish pair of black and white plaid pants. During the primaries, I had easy access to Reagan, that's me with him there, on this Braniff Airlines charter. Relations were so relaxed that on a yellow school bus in Aiken, South Carolina, I sat directly behind the 69-year-old candidate to resolve, hair by hair, the burning national question of whether he used hair coloring. I decided he did not, but he fooled me. He did, we learned later, using his favorite barber at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. After he was nominated, his staff kept him away from the press, lest he wander off the day's message. Nancy Reagan was always there, looking after her Ronnie with that adoring gaze. I took this shot of her on the United Airlines fall campaign charter. Nancy called herself a worrier, and she certainly looks worried here. But Nancy could relax. As the plane went wheels up and climbed out, she would bowl an orange down the aisle, pinball style, trying to make it straight to the rear. The plane often tilted the fruit into our seats, and we booed, but we cheered when she succeeded. One day, the press joined the Reagans on Rancho del Cielo, their rustic retreat 22 miles west of here, on Refugio Road off the 101. Nancy was uncomfortable there, but she would put up with anything to please her Ronnie. The campaign had planned a mass photo shoot of the couple on horses, Reagan once being in a few westerns for Warner Brothers. Camera crews stationed themselves 100 yards down a trail from Ron and Nancy, but they just sat there in their saddles for what seemed like endless minutes. Then I remembered that they used to be movie actors. I shouted, "Action!" And I started down the trail. To eager press. Though we could have trouble reaching Reagan, I cultivated some key sources on campaign strategy. White House Chief of Staff Jim Baker, the shrewd Houston lawyer who became White House Chief of Staff later, came from the camp of running mate George Bush. In time, he would become not only White House Chief of Staff, but Secretary of State. And he directed the legal effort that won Bush v. Gore for the Bush family, for Hillary. So he was called a faithful family servant. Mike Deaver, the California PR man who did a crackerjack job handling communications for the guy called the Great Communicator. That is, until the Iran-Contra scandal. The starkly conservative but likable Ed Meese, who was Reagan's second Attorney General after William French Smith. And the helpful campaign press secretary Jim Brady, grievously wounded beside Reagan in March 1981. The White House press briefing room is named for him. So was the leading gun control group his wife Sarah Brady founded. Reagan's fall campaign got underway with a focus on Southern whites and on evangelical Christians who were just jumping into politics. At one Reagan speech, I collared the Virginia-based Reverend Jerry Falwell for one of his first interviews. We meandered across America, hitting up to 4 cities a day, in a grind that could visibly tire Reagan by day's end. The United flight attendants insisted on serving the journalists enormous first-class meals on every leg of the trip. Some of us shoved the food away while we worked at our primitive laptops. Some of us ate it all and gained a lot of weight. I have to say, Newsweek covered the heck out of Reagan's campaign. I got to know his entire family and his circle of rich friends. I interviewed his older and somewhat envious brother Neil Reagan, Uncle Moon Reagan, down in posh Rancho Santa Fe. He was retired as a very successful advertising executive for McCann Erickson. And Patty Davis, the president's daughter, remains a Facebook friend of mine. Nancy Reagan fixed us up. She wanted us to meet, and we became friendly. There's nothing like a fall campaign for Seeing America. The flag-waving families, the blaring football bands, the blazing riot of Autumn League. In that era, dozens of states were swing states. Reagan felt competitive even in New York City, where he visited the slums of the South Bronx to blame the decay on President Jimmy Carter. That's me taking notes. Just right down there. As late as 1996, Bill Clinton felt comfortable stumping in Texas. That's unthinkable for a Democrat now. With 7 or 8 battleground states as virtually the only places ticket mates go. Things got very partisan very fast. Clinton and Al Gore carried Gore's home state of Tennessee twice in 1992 and 96, but in 2000, Gore could not even carry his own volunteer state. It was gun control and anti-coal that killed the Democrats in Appalachia. That's, I say Appalachia, you say Appalachia, let's call the whole thing off. On any campaign plane, you never knew who would turn out to be your seatmate. On one trip, it was Roland Evans of Evans and Novak. On the next, it might be Harold Raines of the New York Times, later the paper's top editor. My Time magazine rival and seatmate in 1980 was Walter Isaacson, today a best-selling historian and biographer with an incredible resume. I buy all Walter's books now. I even shared an armrest once with Anthony Radziwill, Jackie Kennedy's nephew. On the last day of campaigning for Reagan, we gathered for a group photo taken by Dirk Halstead of Time magazine. I always made sure to squeeze close to a candidate's shoulder. The liberal Washington Post columnist Mary McGrory is next to me. The atmosphere was congenial, largely because of Reagan's sunny personality, so different from Trump. Even then, I wondered at times about Reagan's mental sharpness, but I liked the competence of the people around him, and I bought the image of Jimmy Carter as painfully weak. In November, I voted for the once disliked Ronald Reagan. Not in 1984, mind you. 10 years later, with Reagan out of office, his decline was more apparent when I interviewed him for a critical piece about his retirement for the Los Angeles Times magazine. It was 4 more years before he acknowledged Alzheimer's disease, however. Why was I critical in 1990? Reagan was cashing in on the presidency for up to $250,000 a speech, as Nancy encouraged her amiable husband to keep up with the Bloomingdales and the other billionaires in their California social set. His reputation was starting to suffer. The highlight of 1982 was following Gore Vidal, the novelist, around the state as he challenged Jerry Brown in the Democratic primary for the U.S. Senate. The brilliantly acerbic Vidal was even more intellectual than Brown, who could be tediously Jesuitical, and a pleasure to talk to, but Vidal lost. That fall, Brown lost to Pete Wilson and seemed to be down and out in politics. Later, he deigned to be mayor of Oakland, where I did a sort of where are they now on him. From that low point, he won 2 more terms as governor of California. In 1983, I ran into some trouble over a political vendetta. American Indian movement leader Dennis Banks had been shielded in California by Governor Brown from criminal charges pursued by Republican Governor William Janklow of South Dakota. Janklow resented Sioux Indian tribal court charges of sexual misconduct once leveled at him by Banks. When Brown was succeeded in Sacramento by a Republican, George Duke Major, Banks fled to the Mohawk Reservation in upstate New York. I flew there for a story on the feud and talked to Janklow too. The hard-charging Janklow sued Newsweek for libel just for mentioning the old sexual charges. I had to give a deposition in New York with the powerful governor glaring at me across the table. Jankler's suit, the only legal trouble of my career, was thrown out of court before trial. In the 1984 primaries, the candidate I traveled with was John Glenn of Ohio, but the astronaut senator did not get very far. At the San Francisco Democratic Convention, I watched New York Governor Mario Cuomo give a barn-burning keynote speech, positioning himself for a White House try in 1988, it appeared. Walter Mondale and Geraldine Ferraro were the 84 ticket. I spent a week on the plane for Newsweek with Congresswoman Ferraro. She was the first woman nominated by a major party for a spot on the ticket. It took 36 years for Kamala Harris to be the second one. In 1986, I dropped in on Cuomo in Albany, assessing his presidential chances. But later, he shocked everyone by declining to run amid rumors of mafia connection in his family background. I left Newsweek after 20 years in 1986 to briefly practice law in LA and New York at a giant firm. My networking contact there was the Attorney General, William Fern Smith. I found it boring and hidebound compared to journalism, so I moved to Long Island's Newsday, number 6 U.S. newspaper in circulation, and a sister paper of the Los Angeles Times. They were both owned by the Times Mirror company. My networking contact there was managing editor Tony Morrow, a former Newsweek colleague. It does help to know people. It's not that big a profession. Everybody knows that. After 4 increasingly frustrating years of mostly covering Hollywood for Newsday, more on that next week, I lobbied my way to Newsday's Washington bureau. Within weeks, I went from covering Congress to sharing the White House beat with Susan Page. She left for USA Today and is still there as chief White House correspondent. She's also a CNN panel regular and a friend. At the White House, I observed the last 2 years of George Herbert Walker Bush's single term and the first term of Bill Clinton. For 6 years at State of the Union speeches, I perched just above these two presidents in the House Press Gallery, following along on an advance copy and frantically analyzing the speech for Newsday's readers under crazy deadline pressure. Our bureau boasted 2 Pulitzer Prize winners, but with just 12 reporters, it was not very large, so we often filled in at the State Department, or the Pentagon, or the Justice Department, as well as on Capitol Hill, gaining invaluable background on how politicians govern this nation. What I learned is that everything they do is motivated by the next election. Figure out the political logic behind every decision, and you've got the story linked. My introduction to Bush 41 was at the family compound at Kennebunkport, Maine. For tense days in September 1991, he dealt with a hardline communist coup attempt in Moscow against Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who weathered that crisis. White House press secretary was the capable and personable Marlin Fitzwater, who previously had the job under Reagan as well. Back at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the daily routine became familiar. With our Secret Service badges called hard passes, we passed through metal detectors on Pennsylvania Avenue at a kiosk, then skirted the north lawn to the press briefing area in the West Wing. The other side borders the Rose Garden and a colonnade leading from the Oval Office and the briefing room to the Executive Mansion. In White House jargon, by the way, the Oval Office is called the Oval, and the Secret Service is the Service. Most news conferences are held in the briefing room. Newsday's seat was third row, far right. The room formerly was the White House swimming pool, where Jack Kennedy swam naked with his girlfriends until agents alerted him that Jackie had come home. Nixon filled it in, giving the press a home after years of camping out in the lobby. So that's one nice thing. The press room, with cubicles for news organizations behind it, is just down a carpeted hallway from the Oval. The chief of staff has the next best office down in the corner at the far left. Often the media people walk along the colonnade or through the north portico to the mansion, first occupied in 1800 by John Adams, for special events in the Grand East Room. The family residence, which includes sitting areas and a dining room and the Lincoln bedroom, is on the second and third floors. Few reporters ever get up there. I never did. Nor did I ever get as far as the presidential bedroom on Air Force One. For coverage of presidential events in the Oval and out of the White House, not open to the mass press corps, a small press pool rotating alphabetically among news organizations accompanies the president and provides pool reports for fast feeding to the larger group. Newsday came up for pool duty in the single newspaper reporter slot in the pool about once a month. The pool crams into minivans at the rear of motorcades. It was an elite feeling, I must confess, to watch police motorcycles speed the long procession through red lights and along closed freeway. But we kept in mind that we were there partly as a death watch in case something bad happened to the president. On an Air Force One trip, 14-member press pools switch off on each leg. Since 1990, twin Boeing 747s, tail numbers 28,000 and 29,000, have drawn the Air Force One call sign for most trips. Based at Joint Base Andrews, 7 miles out in Maryland, called Andrews Air Force Base in my time, they're getting $4 billion replacements in 2026. The less roomy old 707s were still in service during my Washington years. Tail number 26,000 was the Kennedy Dallas plane, now at the Air Force Museum in Dayton. Its backup, 27,000, on which I once flew to Knoxville with the senior Bush, is at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley. Any Air Force plane, while carrying the president, is designated Air Force One, even if it's a Learjet. In fact, I pulled with Clinton to the 1996 Army-Navy game on a Navy DC-9 renamed for the occasion. What? Navy One. The Vice President's plane is Air Force Two. Usually it's a Boeing 757, that's what Kamala Harris is riding these days. The same model as Donald Trump's private jet. Of my 20 Air Force One rides, the longest ones came on Bush's 12-day journey from Washington to Hawaii, Australia, Singapore, South Korea, and Japan, as 1991 turned into his unlucky election year, 1992. For all trips, the pool and the larger group flying on an accompanying press plane got the so-called Bible. This was a minute-by-minute schedule of the president's activities and the pool rotation. Journalists checked in at the Andrews Press Center, making last-minute phone calls and waiting to board. Called to the tarmac to ride Air Force One, we put our carry-ons out for searching by the Secret Service agents and the German Shepherds. There were no such searches to board the press charter. Contracted by the White House Travel Office, the planes were different every time. News organizations paid fares set at double first-class rates. We did not go for free. A plane could be from a well-known airline like TWA or Northwest, in fact, everything that's out of business now, to obscure charter companies, Airline of the Americas, who ever heard of that? North American. When sports teams were off for the season, we got their team planes. We flew in the New York Yankees, 727, and the 737 of the National Basketball Association, Miami Heat. You should have seen all the leg room on that one. There was even the MGM Grand Air DC-8 called the Gambler's Special, used to fly big spenders, the whales, to the Las Vegas tables. Not long after we used it, the DC-8 crashed fatally in Saudi Arabia. The charters always treated the journalists well, with White House Press One cards designating our assigned seats. Okay, let's take a ride on Air Force One. We are a newspaper reporter, 3 wire service reporters, a magazine writer and photographer, a wire service photographer, a TV network correspondent with camera and sound crew, and a radio reporter. We board at the plebeian rear of the giant craft as an Air Force steward stands by. On the first-class style seats of the press compartment, a card with destination, arrival time, time zone, altitude, speed, countries flown over, weather forecast. As souvenirs, we can take all the presidential seal M&Ms we can eat. Later, we can also expect a souvenir certificate attesting to our trip as guests of the president. The press compartment is on the starboard side of the 747's rear, Unseen on the port side of the dividing bulkhead is the Secret Service detail, armed with an intimidating arsenal of automatic weapons. Wow, you should see that stuff. It's like a whole army. From a tiny galley, Air Force enlisted personnel serve these compartments the worst military food you can imagine. Little bit bologna sandwiches and potato chips. The big shots up front get the gourmet meals from a world-class galley. When one of these swells walks far back to brief us about the trip, we crowd to the doorway with notebooks, tape recorders, and cameras to capture the information. The briefer might be the president, answering our questions about what the goals are for the mission. We're just trying to be friendly now and then, like the time Bill and Hillary passed out candy. On Bush's Asia trip, we approached the Korean capital, where we are to switch to bare-bones Marine Chinook helicopters for a flight to the National Cemetery. At the Wintry event, I'm the guy in the red woolen scarf watching George and Barbara solemnly light incense and lay a wreath at the tomb of the South Korean unknown soldier. In Tokyo, the final stop, a shock. At a state dinner, we watch in dismay as Bush collapses with a 24-hour flu, throwing up, vomiting in the lap of Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa, kind of wrecking his suit. The First Lady dashes to help her husband, cleaning his face with a dinner napkin before he is ambulanced off to a hospital. Telling Newsday readers about all this, I get little sleep for 2 days until we know that Bush will make a quick recovery. It is not a great omen for him for 1992. Back home, the presidential primaries are beginning. My background with Jerry Brown lands me on his campaign for 30 days without a day off. They kind of left me out there and forgot about it. I switched to Bill Clinton, governor of Arkansas, confident and contrastingly well organized. The previous fall, I had met Bill and Hillary at the Democratic National Committee meeting in Los Angeles, where Hillary icily snapped at me when I alluded to that morning's LA Times story raising the extramarital rumors about her husband. Some people say Hillary wasn't likable, sometimes she wasn't. Sure enough, the Jennifer Flowers scandal from the past blows in out of Clinton's Little Rock background. It almost sinks him in the New Hampshire primary. I fly out to Little Rock and locate one Finest D. Shellnut, who was Ms. Flowers' boyfriend at the time she claims she was having an affair with the governor. Shellnut sadly confirms her story. Yeah, she cheated on me, he said. June 1992, on the way to the first United Nations Climate Change Conference in Rio de Janeiro, Bush unwisely stops in Panama City, Panama, to crow about the U.S. invasion he ordered a year earlier that seized President Manuel Noriega on federal drug smuggling charge. Predictably, Noriega still has angry nationalist followers. They march toward where Bush is speaking in the Central Plaza. Army troops fire tear gas that drifts over Bush and the crowd. We all get a stiff dose of the gas. The Secret Service drags Bush off the podium. Coughing, eyes stinging, he flees for the U.S. Embassy while we flee for the airport. From Air Force One on the long night hop down to Brazil, I dispatched yet another embarrassing story about the president's bad luck abroad. Bush has been the very last world leader to sign up for the Rio Climate Summit. The environment is anathema to his party's Pat Buchanan right wing, which Bush barely beat back in the primaries, and whose votes he needs for November. So while latecomer Bush manages to find rooms at a Sheraton near Ipanema, nothing is left for the press corps but a spicy pink no-tell motel where Rio businessmen have nooners with their mistresses. The ceilings have mirrors. Turn on the TV, you get pornography. Despite this hilarious snub, I say nothing about it to Bush while I watch him jog at the Naval Cadet School below Sugarloaf Mountain. Clinton and Al Gore become Bush's Democratic challenger. I split my time between them and Bush. On the Clinton-Gore bus, I develop ideal sources for Newsday. Their chief strategist, Paul Begala, George Stephanopoulos, and James Carville, the Cajun who coined that year's long-remembered phrase, "It's the economy, stupid." That's what won for Clinton. It's an open secret that Carville and Mary Madeline, a strategist for Bush, and another source of mine, are privately in love. In the spin room after a debate, the pair elaborately stand back to back, pretending to be strangers, and praising their respective candidates. The politically unlikely couple married after the election. They're still together. The long era of whistle-stop campaigning by rail is nearing its end, but George H.W. Bush relies on it on a tour of usually reliable Republicans, North and South Carolina, and you know when they're going to states like that, they're in trouble. I take my personal photos as Bush speaks from the rear platform in Republican towns like Thomasville, North Carolina, and Camden, South Carolina. The formerly segregationist Senator Ole Strom Thurmond is handing out brownies on the train. Ole Strom is pretty much gaga by this point. At Senate hearings, as we see, he painfully reads the questions his staff writes, telling witnesses at the microphones, talking to the machine, talking to the machine. New Jersey is a solidly blue state today, but in 1992, it's purple. Bush makes the last stand in southern New Jersey Republican towns. Helicopters carry the entourage to Philadelphia suburbs like Wildwood and Cherry Hill. Bush seems in good spirits, but his rally crowds nationwide are growing dangerously hostile to reporters as polls show him trailing. A furious young man invades our press tent in Oregon. Spit flying, he screams hatred. Network crews receive so many death threats, they send an envoy to Bush at his dinner table one night on the road, beseeching him to calm things down. Ever the preppy gentleman, Bush tries. From then on, he exhorts his fans to blame the media bosses, not us working stiffs on the press platform. Why in 1992 was it starting to get so nasty? Politics had been reasonably civil for years. Reagan and the very partisan House Speaker Tip O'Neill, a Democrat, liked each other. Two big Irishmen who could hoist a bourbon together at day's end. They found ways to compromise on tax and immigration bill. That give and take ethos was too cozy for a Georgia congressman named Newt Gingrich. Tired of 40 years of Democratic control of Congress, he started throwing bombs, demonizing Democrats with adjectives like evil, sick, grotesque. The Atlantic magazine calls Gingrich the man who broke politics. Gingrich was far from alone. Led by Rush Limbaugh and a new crop of conservative broadcasters, Republicans adopted Gingrich's rejection of the old order. I noticed that fall that suddenly everyone at Republican rallies, every Bush surrogate, was quoting Rush, 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 cheering when Bush mentioned it. Nonetheless, Bush lost. I kept track of him. In 1993, I profiled him in his low-profile retirement for the LA Times magazine. Aware that his reasonable image might hurt the party chances of his more conservative sons, George W. and Jeb, he steered clear of political comment. He answered my questions by email from a millionaire friend's yacht in the Mediterranean, but he was circumspect. Meanwhile, I visited his office in Houston and opened a kitchen cabinet. By God, George H.W. Bush really did eat fried pork rinds. Sure, I got it. And the next year, covering President Nixon's funeral, I saw Bush out in public again, seated with all living Democratic and Republican presidents and First Lady. That was a good place to also meet Nixon Watergate loyalists like plumber G. Gordon Liddy. Hillary and Bill were in the White House, new people with new staffers that I introduced to Newsday's readers. Clinton broke some new ground. He introduced D.D. Myers from Southern California, from Santa Clarita, as the first woman press secretary, later succeeded by Mike McCurry. That's us on a plane. Reagan took years to mention the AIDS crisis. Bush did little better, though Barbara posed with an AIDS baby to soften the image. But I was with Clinton when he shook hands with this AIDS patient for the cameras at a Georgetown hospital. Nobody was doing that. Clinton had misfortunes in his first term, his health care plan, shepherded by Hillary, failing to pass, losing Congress to Gingrich's Contract with America in 1994, shaking up his cabinet. As a regional paper, Newsday was not on the A-list with the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the network. I told our deputy Washington editor, Carl, the good news is we're playing in the big leagues. The bad news is we're playing for the Milwaukee Brewers. But when I needed to, I could get an audience with top officials like the canny Leon Panetta from Monterey, who went from budget director to White House chief of staff, and under President Obama was CIA director and defense secretary. What a public servant he was. Seated next to him by chance on one commercial flight, I had the White House chief of staff all to myself in 1995 for 3 hours. Andrew Cuomo was HUD Secretary, Housing and Urban Development. He was quick to return my calls, if only because my ex-wife Jeannie once wrote an upbeat piece about him for New York Magazine. Also, Newsday was a New York paper, and he wanted to be governor of New York, like his father, which he became. Still, I had one particular favorite in the Clinton administration, Socks the Cat. I first petted Socks at the Arkansas governor's mansion. I got the chance again at the White House briefing room podium on a quiet Saturday morning, and we could see Socks sunning himself out on the south lawn, secured to a stake in the ground by a long tether. As a cat person, naturally I wrote a feature on the first cat. Chelsea Clinton told me, he's so noble. But the Clintons mainly ignored him, frankly. When the Clintons left power, they gave the tuxedo tomcat to Betty Curry, Clinton's secretary. To politicians, pets are props. A good number of journalists become TV personalities in Washington, but except for 2 C-SPAN appearances, I did not. My White House partner, Susan Page, did. At the Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston, one day in 1993, I had one near brush with fame. It could have been a career killer. Clinton was about to arrive to dedicate a new library wing. The press preceded him, ushered into a curtained-off holding area. On the other side of the curtain, Jackie Kennedy Onassis, Caroline, Teddy, and other family members all waited in the receiving line. On a mindless whim, I tucked my press badge away, parted the curtain, and mingled with the Kennedys like Woody Allen's Zelly, standing quietly in the line right next to Jackie. I guess I was hoping to pass as a library staffer or something. Nobody noticed me. Minutes went by as we waited until I thought, my God, what am I doing here? And beat a last-second retreat. Jackie Onassis died of cancer the following year, 64. One White House perk was following presidents to the annual fall opening of the UN General Assembly in New York. I always glimpsed an all-star array of world leaders. Fidel Castro in his revolutionary fatigue, King Hassan II of Morocco in the royal fez, and Yasser Arafat of the PLO in the kafiyeh currently so fashionable on college campuses. Reminds me of a joke. Sarah Netanyahu's wife, was introducing Yasser Arafat to her husband, and she said, "Yasser, that's my Bibi." Okay, let's move on. There was more Air Force One travel, a state visit to Ottawa, and Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien in 1995. A domestic trip to Georgia and Florida the next month was more typical of the domestic travel routine. At Andrews, a young Clinton aide named Josh King showed up with the presidential seal for installation on podiums along the way. 747 landed at Dobbins Air Force Base in Marietta outside Atlanta. The press pool walked under the giant wing for the standard shot of the president walking off the aircraft. We boarded Sikorsky Sea Stallions for downtown Atlanta. The blonde man just left of center is Jay Carney of Time magazine, later President Obama's White House press secretary. At left here was one of my best White House sources, presidential assistant John Emerson, a lawyer I knew from California. John's main job was to win California for Clinton in 1996, and he did. Landing in the parking lot of the Georgia Dome Arena, Clinton delivered a pep talk to the organizers of the 1996 Atlanta Olympics with 17 months to go. He moved on to address the friendly Georgia legislature. And from there, to stay overnight with Governor Zell Miller at the governor's mansion. Miller later turned his back on the Democrats and spoke at a Republican convention. The South was trending solidly Republican, though Georgia recently has reverted to battleground status. Next day, Bill and Hillary said farewell to Georgia. I was off Air Force One and onto the press plane, where passengers included Britt Hume on the left and Wolf Blitzer on the right. We were bound for Tallahassee, Florida, capital of a state that Democrats still could win in those days, not like now. Governor Lawton Chiles was a Democrat, and having defeated Jeb Bush in 1994, Bush did win in 1998. I sat in the governor's chair in a hearing room, leaving to watch Clinton schmoozing with the legislature. Florida legislature, I think there's about 2 Democrats left in it. It was 1995, but Clinton clearly was focused on 1996 re-election, making an 18th visit to Electoral College Prize, California, hosting Russian President Boris Yeltsin at FDR's Hyde Park home on a spectacular fall day, then welcoming Pope John Paul II at Newark Airport. Irma and I met in Vermont that summer of 1995. One of the first dates, our first dates, was a White House Christmas party. I suppose she was impressed because she stuck with me. Then it was 1996, another election year. Colin Powell, wooed by both parties, was cast by the pundits as a serious contender for the Republican nomination against Senator Bob Dole of Kansas. But I went to the bombshell news conference where Powell announced he would not run. Word was that his wife, Alma, was desperately worried about some James Earl Ray type assassinating her husband if he was the first black president. No other newspaper writer in the press corps seemed interested in going with the president to the Atlanta Olympics, but as the finisher of 26 marathons, I eagerly volunteered for the pool slot. First, we detoured to JFK Airport in New York, where Clinton comforted families who lost loved ones at a TWA flight that exploded over the Atlantic right offshore after takeoff. Clinton took 16-year-old Chelsea with him for a day clearly planned as an appeal to women voters. Father and daughter viewed only women's Olympics and women's swimming, prompting me to appraise the trip as clever gender gap politics. Taking a vacation break and a traditional, polite, low political profile as the rival party staged this convention in San Diego, Clinton, his family, and the press flew to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. The party made a side trip by helicopter up to Yellowstone National Park, where Clinton made an environmental speech announcing he was blocking a nearby mining project. In the audience was John Denver, and he looked kind of Rocky Mountain High at the time. A pool was organized for what was billed as an easy 2-mile family hike. What we got with no preparation was a hot, grueling 8 miles of sliding shale and no water. The press was ordered to walk far ahead of the Clintons, so we saw nothing of their hike while we were getting thirsty and exhausted. But a staff aide explained, "It's their hike, not yours." The Clintons caught up with us at the end for a misleadingly cheerful group photo. That's me to the right of Hillary's hat rim. The network cameraman at the right could barely walk. My pool report was scathing. I blamed the White House press office for what I called a death march of dehydration. The Washington Post picked up the story. Clinton chuckled about the death march hyperbole, but he half apologized. The Republicans nominated Bob Dole. I climbed on his campaign plane in Phoenix for a Western swing. Let me tell you something about Bob Dole. He started out as a slashing partisan, not a very nice guy, but he mellowed into a very decent human being. when Myron Waldman, Newsday's Capitol Hill correspondent and the dean of the Senate Press Gallery, died in 1995 during Congress's summer recess, Senate Majority Leader Dole flew from Kansas to join the Newsday staff at Mike Waldman's funeral on a 100-degree day. But Dole was about as lucky on this opening tour as George Bush had been in Japan and Panama. Faced with taunts that he was too old at 73, how quaint that sounds in 2024, Dole blew it in Los Angeles by archaically referring to the Dodgers as the Brooklyn Dodgers. I took note of that in Newsday. Then, speaking from an outdoor stage up in Chico the same day, Dole leaned against a railing that careless staffers had not bolted down. It gave way and he fell, painfully landing in the lap of an Associated Press photographer. Could have broken his neck. The photo made him look old, frail, and hapless. I went back to the Clinton campaign, but reported on Dole again at their debate. And there's no crazier deadline pressure for a daily newspaper than a late-night debate trying to be sensitive on deadline. Clinton took the opportunity to one-up Dole with a presidential appearance at the G7 summit in Lyon, France. Clinton, giddy with momentum 2 years after his clobbering of the 1994 midterm, took off on a whistle-stop railroad tour through traditionally Republican as well as Democratic Midwestern states, West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana. He was feeling pretty confident. He called the train the 21st Century Express, sounding a note of forward-looking youth to contrast with his older opponent. My souvenir poster here was lost in our house fire. Any campaign train actually is a blast from the past, the 19th century past. I'm enjoying the throwback tactic here with Mara Eliason of NPR. Clinton was boyishly exuberant. From morning until way after dark, he lingered on the open rear platform. He blew the train horn, making stream of consciousness comments over loudspeakers to curious onlookers as we slow rolled by farm fields. Nice garden, he told one woman. I like your dog. Near the end, Norman Mailer bar hopped with us in New Orleans' French Quarter. He tired early and we walked him back to the hotel. No Democrat bothers to campaign in Louisiana now. I spent election night with the Clintons in Little Rock as they celebrated their convincing victory. The next spring, it was time for the annual White House Correspondents' Dinner at the Washington Hilton. Until Trump, presidents always came for our association's scholarship fundraising event, even though John Hinckley had shot Reagan at the hotel. The dinner was evolving into a competition to see which news bureaus could attract the biggest Washington newsmakers at our tables, and in a new wrinkle, Hollywood star. Politics and Hollywood, maybe beautiful, maybe ugly, were linking up. In fact, they still linked up financially. The Democrats at least get an awful lot of money from Hollywood people, and the Republicans are starting to get a lot from Silicon Valley, also in California. Our organization was widely mocked that glitz seemed so elitist, self-indulgent, smugly self-referential. All this schmoozing with the rich and famous. But what did I care? I was having a great time. One year I overheard Michael Douglas behind my chair introducing his then-wife Deandra Douglas to a star he apparently had never met. Deandra, he said, I'd like you to meet Barbara Streisand. Streisand! That's Streisand! The singer snapped at him. More about her next week. Newsday gave a good account of itself in the guest awards. We had Alan Greenspan, Janet Reno, stars of The West Wing, 4-star generals at our table. I invited Walter Capps of Santa Barbara as my 1997 dinner guest. He accepted, then called back. I won't go without my wife Lois, he said. Can you get a second ticket for her? I could not. This devoted husband canceled his attendance. Instead, my guest was, of all people, Joseph Camarada, the lawyer for Paula Jones, the Arkansas woman suing Clinton for sexual harassment in the latest scandal. That gave me a glimpse into the booming right-wing world. At conservative pre-parties and post-parties at the Hilton that night, Camarada and I were lionized by Fox News the National Review, and other Republican-oriented entities. Internal politics at Newsday lost me the White House beat after 6 years. Reassigned to the Supreme Court, I was certainly qualified, but not happy about it. I quit following Susan Page to the rapidly expanding USA Today. The newspaper sent me back to Los Angeles, fine with me because that's where Irma lived. I could not get away, however, from Clinton's scandals. Monica Lewinsky was from Los Angeles. I was in the howling media mob on her father's lawn when she came home in crestfallen notoriety from testifying to Kenneth Starr in Washington. I went back to D.C. to cover Clinton's impeachment from historical and legal perspectives. Sources of legal opinion were constitutional scholars like Jamie Raskin, then the American University professor, now a prominent House Democrat from Maryland. He was on the January 6th committee. And someone else currently in the news from the other side, John Eastman of Chapman University, who provided a conservative viewpoint. He's now been indicted. Most helpful of all was the ultimate insider, Greg Craig, Clinton's chief lawyer for the Senate trial that acquitted the president. My law degree was really paying off. 2 years afterward, in 2000, a newcomer named Adam Schiff challenged Congressman Jim Rogan of Glendale and Pasadena, one of the House Republican impeachment managers, against Clinton. I interviewed them both. Schiff won. He's still in Congress, and he is probably the next senator from California. The 2000 presidential primaries were on. I trudged through the snow of Iowa and New Hampshire with Al Gore and Bill Bradley, moving on to the warmer climate of South Carolina with Senator John McCain. Coming full circle from the 1960 convention in Los Angeles, I was back downtown for the 2000 Democratic Convention that nominated Al Gore and Joe Lieberman. I was able to give USA Today stories on old local friends, Dick Tuck, and former city councilwoman Rosalind Wyman, a leader in bringing the Los Angeles Dodgers from Brooklyn. I had summer clerked in law school for her late husband's Beverly Hills litigation firm. Other USA Today reporters were exhausted when the convention ended, so I grabbed the chance to red-eye with the ticket mates to La Crosse, Wisconsin on the Mississippi. They kicked off their campaign with a 4-day river cruise on a fake steamboat, heading south to Hannibal, Missouri, with a Mark Twain impersonator before. The candidates docked for rallies in Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, and Missouri. One night out on the top deck, we all danced together, the supposedly wooden Gore boogieing with his wife Tipper. From Labor Day to Election Day, I was in Dick Cheney's 6-member press corps as he took his vice presidential campaign from his Jackson Hole home there to a panoply of red states. Cheney and Texas Governor George W. Bush kicked off the campaign on Labor Day in Republican Naperville, Illinois, where an open mic caught Bush telling his running mate, "Oh look, there's Adam Clymer, New York Times, Major League asshole." "Oh yeah, he is, big time," Cheney nodded. On Cheney's plane, his press corps used the phrase "big time" as a running joke. The taciturn Cheney was not very congenial, but we all got along in the close quarters. See, that's me off the right shoulder again. Liz Cheney is not in this group, group shot, but Scooter Libby is. The first man you see over on the right. He ended up in prison during the subsequent administration, but President George W. Bush commuted his sentence. He was a top aide to Cheney. We went down to Central College in Danville, Kentucky for Cheney's vice presidential debate with Lieberman. Many were surprised when Cheney clearly won the debate. He did his job, shoring up Bush's support in Republican areas while adding a Washington insider's weight to Bush's slim national resume. But Florida was looking tight, and the pressure was on Governor Jeb Bush, W's brother. When Cheney met Jeb for a speech in Tallahassee, we walked over to the governor. Preemptively, defensively, he shouted, "We're going to carry Florida! We're going to carry Florida!" Well, you remember how that worked out. Bush led the election count by 537 votes out of 5 million cast. Jeb's appointed Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, did her best to shut down the vote by hastily certifying Bush as the winner. But Gore demanded and got a recount under state law. Bush sued to stop it. For 5 weeks, I reported on the historic litigation in Tallahassee courts, ending up in the Florida Supreme Court twice. On weekends, I flew home to Irma in California. In the process, I became a victim of violent crime. Late one Sunday night in November, I returned from LA. I was checking into the budget Ramada Inn in a dicey Tallahassee neighborhood where USA Today had kind of booked me unthinkingly. A young guy in a black stocking mask walked into the lobby and put a pistol to my head. Hands up, I walked with him to the terrified young woman clerk at the front desk. The gunman escaped with $200 from the cash register, but forgot to rob me. I rebooked myself quickly at the best hotel in town, Holiday Inn. A Fort Lauderdale paper ran a story on the robbery incident. I received a personal apology from the mayor of Tallahassee. That was it. The recount case went up to the U.S. Supreme Court twice, first as Bush v. Harris, which my friend Larry Tribe argued, later as Bush v. Gore. The justices, as you know, twice found for Bush along party lines, 5-4. The final decision, released at 10 p.m. in the dark of night, was so jumbled that our editors were uncertain how to interpret it. Reading the legalese online, I called in from Tallahassee and told them, "I know it says they're remanding it to Florida, but trust me, it's over. Bush won." I witnessed political history of another kind 3 years later. Governor Gray Davis of California, a plodding Democrat I had known for years, was facing a recall election damaged by energy shortages cooked up by crooked Enron executives in Texas, who later went to prison for it. A big, zany cast of characters filed to win the governorship, and Davis lost the recall, surprisingly led by the Republican Arnold Schwarzenegger. Politics in Hollywood, linked again. The crazy California story was catnip to USA Today and every national organization. For 6 wild weeks, I churned out daily story after story. Never have I worked so frantically. And after Arnold won, USA Today gave me an internal award. The Democrats next year nominated John Kerry for president, and for months I crisscrossed America with Kerry, and running mate John Edwards, again off the right shoulder there. Politics came to a respectful halt for Ronald Reagan's funeral observances, for which I wrote the page 1 lead stories about the ultimately widely revered 40th president whose career I had followed for so long. Then we were back on Kerry's campaign plane through up and down polls and lighter moments, our itinerary reduced to that dwindling number of battleground states. You know this limerick? There was a young man from Nantucket.
Yes.
That was John Kerry. He took a campaign break to windsurf at the Nantucket third home he shared with his mega-millionaire wife, Teresa. Republicans seized on Kerry's hobby to paint him as a flip-flopper blowing with the wind. It worked. When our house fire broke out 2 years ago, I was drifting off to sleep in the Nantucket t-shirt I kept from that week. I wore it last night. It still smells like smoke a little bit. Kerry, wrongly declining to rebut Republican lies about his Navy record in Vietnam, carried on with a robust campaign schedule. crowds were impressive and loud, like the throng in this November picture I took in Minnesota. In fact, with just 25,000 more votes in Ohio, Kerry would have unseated Bush 43. J.D. Vance's Ohio was now out of reach for Democrats. For the home stretch, I switched to the John Edwards plane, observing his debate with Cheney and how Edwards worked himself to exhaustion for the Democratic ticket, giving it all he had. Jimmy Buffett supported him in Florida, and the mood on the trail was upbeat. But then came my last presidential campaign election night. I took my last picture of John Kerry at Faneuil Hall in Boston as he conceded the election. Politics were not quite over for me. I reported on the sweeping Democratic midterm gains of 2006 as Americans tired of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in 2007, the first candidate cattle shows of the looming 2008 presidential campaign. My final story, change at the Nixon Library in California. The National Archives taking it over from the Nixon family and making the place much less worshipful. I'm so thankful that I was retired, not working the White House beat, during what Donald Trump hopes to call his first term. Feeding his angry MAGA base, he plunged relations with the media to an all-time bottom. The traditional, respectful White House daily briefings were abolished. When Trump appeared, it was all insults, lies, and advice to swallow bleach to cure COVID. No, I was well out of there, with few regrets these days about saying farewell to contemporary political reporting and its environment. A farewell which I said with a parting flourish in Yorba Linda, California, at the Presidential Library of Richard Milhous Nixon. Questions? From the press gallery, before he became president. And when the Vietnam War was on, he was running into big trouble. And who should he call for war advice but former General Dwight D. Eisenhower, former President Eisenhower. They met at Marsh Air Force Base in Riverside. And I was there driving out from LA to watch this meeting during the Vietnam War. Johnson was desperately relying on, one, Republican support for his war moves, and two, the advice of the general, the old general. That didn't work. We kept on in Vietnam, losing 58,000 American troops. And Johnson was out of office as a result. He, as you remember, he was beaten, not beaten, but in the first New Hampshire primary in '68, Johnson was running for re-election. And Gene McCarthy, unlikely senator, not that likable a guy, kind of a acerbic, intellectual guy, ran against him just as an anti-war protest candidate and almost won. He got 40% of the vote against the incumbent president of the United States. Pat Buchanan did almost that well in '92 against George Bush. A right-wing revolt in the party against a more moderate guy. They loved Reagan, but they thought Reagan was too good. So it was the sign that they were taking over the party, which eventually they did. And they really have it now. So Johnson, when seeing that 40% against him, Johnson dropped out in favor of his vice president, very pro-war vice president, going along with Johnson, never said a word against him, as Kamala Harris did not dare to do against any of Biden's policies, in favor of Hubert Humphrey. And it all came down to Chicago, and we know what happened there. The establishment candidate won, even though he had entered no primary, and Bobby was dead by then, when McCarthy had gone to Chicago, but finished second. And meanwhile, there was this rioting in the streets, mainly due to the police clubbing everybody, and with more tear gas. Humphrey went on with a nomination to change his tune on the war toward the end. And he almost won. Another week he would have won. He would have beat Nixon. The polls were very much trending in his direction by the time the '68 campaign came around. Nixon started that whole thing that Reagan really went with, which was what's called the Southern strategy. White people in the South, lock up, change the South from the solid South, Democratic since Reconstruction, to Republican. And it's almost totally locked up now, except for Georgia. Anyway, that's, I guess, the answer. Yes, hon.
You alluded to the fact that Fox News and MSNBC are allowing their political views to come into their reporting. How about the press? Your,
Yeah,
your comment on
there's
what's
been a
happening?
change there too.
Yeah.
Traditionally, we would never use the word lie. That somebody, a politician, had lied. But then Trump came along.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Yeah.
There was a guy named Glenn Kessler at the Washington Post who recorded, his job was to record Trump's lies. And he recorded 30,000 lies in Trump's term. And so what do you do? So the New York Times, the august New York Times, started calling lies and still does. All the networks are using lie. PBS, Irma and I were devoted watchers of PBS NewsHour and heartily recommend it to everybody. They use lies too.
Yeah, but I think it's a little more subtle too, that.
Yeah, the cable networks
Yes.
and even CNN, which is obviously tries to be a little more neutral, but it's almost as left as MSNBC if you listen carefully. I mean, it's a decent network. I don't watch Fox, I don't watch NBC, but on election nights, I watch CNN because I like the analysts, which include James Carville.
Are there any journalists that you read now, or what
Sure.
newspapers?
Well, we're like the last people in America who take the print edition of the New York Times every day. Go out on my street in the morning in my bathrobe in the fog, and it's the only little blue newspaper wrapper on the street. It was that way in LA too. But we read the New York Times, and I read the New Yorker. That's very good on politics and other things. I had a subscription to the Atlantic for a while, but it was just too much. So I gave that up. But there are some good things I recommend the Atlantic, as well as the New Yorker and the New York Times. And it's possible, of course, to read the Washington Post by getting a digital subscription to them. And that's worth reading too.
Can't read.
Very good. It's always been good at politics. For years, it was much better at politics than the New York Times. They pretty much got their act together. And even though Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, has unlimited money, they still lose a fortune. And I don't even know how long he can keep that up, losing so many millions of dollars a year. Still going.
All right, thank you.
Thought we had another question. Any others?
Yeah.
Back here. Yeah.
No?
Bob?
Yes, hi.
I'm interested in the relationship between Gingrich and Clinton. Because
yeah.
Gingrich was in charge of the House,
Yeah.
and Clinton being the president, they came to some kind of an agreement with a budget that created these surpluses.
I think they may have had the first government shutdown then. But anyway, it was tough on Clinton. He took such a shellacking, as he called it, in the 1994 midterm, losing Congress after 40 years of that. And we talked to him in the East Room the next morning. And somebody actually stood up and said, "Mr. President, are you relevant anymore?" And he had to defend his relevance over the next 2 years. And everybody thought he was doomed for 1996 after that. But he came back with brilliant
Triangulation.
triangulation against Gingrich and the Republicans on one hand and the left wing of his party on the other hand. He was the guy in the middle, and he went very small bore politics. School uniforms he advocated, that kind of thing. Just little stuff that restored his reputation as kind of a caring, moderate, centrist, all-American kind of middle-class oriented president. And so he counteracted Gingrich and amazingly won big. Gingrich was involved in impeaching Clinton after that 96 victory. And then it came out that he and was impeaching him over the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And it came out that Gingrich had been having affairs himself. And so he was actually, had to resign as speaker. So Clinton won that one. Yes, huh?
Santa Barbara has its own style of intense politics. Do you find yourself drawn to some of our issues?
Well, I read I used to like the Santa Barbara News Press. I think it was a really good newspaper.
was.
And we should all miss it.
We do.
It was great. I even actually met old man Thomas More Stork once
Wow.
years ago. It's just a terrible thing that this city doesn't have a real daily newspaper.
It's awful.
But I do read the news websites for what they're worth, EdHack and newshawk.com.
Jerry Roberts, he also has a blog that's.
No,
pretty
Robert
regular.
Madden, no, I didn't.
You don't know him?
Cool, great. Yeah, Santa Barbara deserves better local coverage than it gets. And it's just too bad. I mean, this is a major city as far as I'm concerned. It's just
We all agree.
unfortunate.
Yeah, I'm with you.
It's just too bad. I would, if somebody gave me $1 billion, I would buy the news press and start it up. Okay.